Welcome to the VMware Multi-Cloud Podcast. My name is Eric Nilsson. With me today, I have my co-host, David Jasso. David, how you doing today?
I'm doing well, Eric. How you doing today?
I'm doing pretty good. Coming up into the end of the year. Excited about that. On the show today, we're going to be talking about managing multi-cloud infrastructure with Terraform and vRealize automation. And we're lucky enough to have Cody Carlson. Cody is a solutions architect for the VMware Global Support Team. So David, why don't you take us through that?
Thank you, Eric. Hey, Cody, good to have you on today. Hey,
good to be here.
We wanted to start with a little bit of background. That's how we usually kick these things off with our guest. I'm particularly interested in this idea, and you and I talked about that solution architects as part of a global support team. So, as you cover off on your background, maybe you can tell us a little bit about that role.
Yeah, so I am a solution architect, as you said, within global support at VMware. I've been here for just over about 9 years now. I've worked exclusively in the cloud management space, supporting customers, working with TSEs, working with the engineering teams during that whole role, and it's all been specifically within cloud management. The solution architect team in global support is something worth talking about. It's definitely different than what people are familiar with from the solution architect perspective that we have in our field roles. I actually was the third solution architect that came into this role, so I've had the luck and the happiness of being able to help guide and control sort of the way that this role has developed. The goal of that role, of course, was to create a senior set of backline resources that can work with our frontline engineers, work with customers on the highly escalated situations, and then drive product improvement, perform training, mentorship. So there was a lot of gaps that we filled as a team, and it's sort of evolved over the years, over the last few years, into something a little bit more, I would say, policy-based, something a little bit more trackable in what we do. It's definitely refined a lot more.
Yeah. So yep. I think what was really interesting, you and I had a little brief conversation before about this but most of the solution architects we deal with are involved and engaged with customers on the front end, right? Before they've deployed anything. You come in on the back end, and then generally after something's not worked out well, and then maybe you could tell us a little bit about what that looks like.
Sure. Yeah. So last year, our team, the solution architect team itself, moved underneath our escalation branch for under support. So what that did was that actually gave us the ability to really focus on high impact issues that customers encounter. The wide scale escalations, but the really good piece of this is that it allowed us to close the loop and analyze these escalations when they finish. So what we do a lot of at this point is we will look into these escalations that occurred. We try to figure out why they occurred in the first place, how to prevent them, and then proactively find ways of making sure this doesn't happen in the future for customers, for our engineers and our developers. What happens is we do a closed loop process. We review escalations, and then from that, we will build a number of different solutions. One of them would be a product quality solution. So we'd work with the BUs to improve the product in some way that prevents these kind of issues from occurring. We work to create internal tools for our teams here as well as for customers. So we will provide input based on our escalation work for Skyline, and we will also work for, sorry, hang on one second. Give me one second. Sorry about that. So as I was saying, we will provide input for Skyline, for customers, for proactive support. We deliver training to engineers. From time to time, we get to deliver that training to customers. We create a variety of knowledge articles, blog posts, things like that. So it really does give us a lot of reach into the actual product quality in order to drive that for everyone.
So today, Cody, we're going to talk about Terraform and vRealize, and I know you did a session around that at VMworld. Before we get into that, maybe we can talk about this concept of infrastructure as code, because that's at the heart of this. Maybe you can talk about infrastructure as code and why it's so important to DevOps, and sort of how people think about it and why they're using it.
Sure. Yeah. So infrastructure as code. Obviously, automation scripting has been around for as long as I've been around in the industry. Back in the day, I remember embedding PowerShell scripts into SharePoint right? Just so that customers or so that users have the ability to self-serve without me having to do all the work for them, right? I mean, and at the end of the day, I think a lot of the scripting that's involved in automations, it's been improved over time, but in a lot of ways, it's still unchanging, right? At the end of the day, we're trying to execute scripts or execute API calls against something with as little effort as possible, but allow people to self-serve that. One of the things I really see infrastructure as code resolving these days is the need for your technical teams, your developers, to really have a handle on all of the scripting languages that are required to drive the business. So, developers are obviously going to want to leverage their own code, leverage code-based solutions, but do we want to really teach them all of the API calls required to leverage code-driven infrastructure for AWS and Azure or your vSphere? So there's all of that. Not to mention what formats are they sending things through? JSON, Python, all of these things that your users really need to have access to. It becomes a little overwhelming to teach and keep them up to date. And when things change in the business, you have to dynamically train everybody. You have to adjust everybody. I think that's really a huge area where infrastructure as code is helping. What I see is infrastructure as code sort of creating an abstraction of scripting, much in the way that VMware does with physical hardware. Infrastructure as code takes all of the API calls and it takes scripting languages required to automate infrastructure, and it extracts those into a common language that once learned can be applied across multiple platforms.
Yeah, I see infrastructure as code as kind of a natural evolution of a few trends. One is the whole virtualized infrastructure, right? It's effectively, you've turned all your infrastructure into software, so you can code against it. And then it solves some of the problems that you had when you did scripting, which was you had a bunch of these scripts floating around and a lot of knowledge that was only in people's heads in terms of where that fit. So it sort of like takes it to the next level. You start to treat it just like you would feature code, right? So you can version control it, put it in a repository, and then just make it part of the application stack. So I think that's really interesting.
The other thing that I notice, David, and maybe Cody, you can address this, is that what I'm watching, because I've been in DevOps for a long time, written a lot of makefile scripts for compiling, and then trying to get into production, is that you could do that in the old days when your infrastructure was fairly, straightforward, right? But if you look at microservice applications, you look at the network infrastructure, the cloud infrastructure, the storage infrastructure, the compute infrastructure, and how complicated a modern day architecture is now, it's just very difficult to get your head around how to build these type of scripts, right? And so without a higher level of capability that pulls all this together, right? It's almost getting impossible to create a scripting environment that would actually manage all the complicated components at the component level. And I feel like there just needs to be some help, because it gets harder and harder to just do this with and tracking down what's actually failing when it does fail, because of the complexity of the software stack that is creating your infrastructure in the first place.
Yeah, great point.
Yeah, definitely.
The one other thing related to that, Eric, I think about that infrastructure as code solves is, as you said, this sort of troubleshooting issue. The whole idea here is that you don't tinker, with the configurations, right? You sort of set them down, and then if they're not working, you blow them away by simply redeploying the code. So you really just have a really great handle on the fidelity, if you will, of the environments, which is, I think, a really important aspect of it as well. Cody, you've been doing some work around Terraform, and Terraform has become super popular, almost like lingua franca, if you will, for cloud, right, for provisioning. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what Terraform is and why it's so popular.
Yeah. So I think you kind of hit on it. One of the main reasons Terraform has become really popular is that it's a very simple to understand form of abstraction of all of this. But on top of that, there's a broad range of cloud endpoints. It has a huge community of open source contributors. Terraform focuses specifically on code. So everything is in code. Now, in the case of Terraform, they chose to create their own language. So their language behind it, HCL, it's HashiCorp language. It's JSON compatible. It's human readable, machine usable. So that's a really nice feature, that it's very easy to dig into Terraform scripting and understand fairly quickly what you're looking at, as well as how to write it very easily. And again, the range of endpoints and capabilities that are out there for it, I think really, really helps to drive the popularity of it.
Yeah, it's become really popular for people that work across more than one environment too, right? Because you can have a script that's going to work, sort of a generic script, and then you substitute in parameters. Maybe talk a little bit about how people are using it to deal with more than one environment.
Yeah. So and I can kind of speak from personal experience, and this might not be, I'm not exactly a developer, right? But in global support here, we frequently have to deploy and configure environments that we use to reproduce issues on and do troubleshooting and things like that. Initially when getting into Terraform, I ran into a lot of questions, and I was thinking, this is just something I couldn't solve through a UI based product or something like that. But what actually happened was when I first learned Terraform, I realized that from a vRealize automation perspective, I could stage a vRealize 8 instance in my environment, and then using Terraform, I could run a script that would completely configure everything within it. And this was a process that I didn't really have a problem doing, but we were talking 30, 40 minutes of effort and, copying keys and codes and passwords and endpoint URLs and things like that. Really just to configure everything and get it up and ready. And now I'm ready for my reproduction. But, as an initial test, I really just said, well, what can I do with Terraform just when deploying this particular environment? And in the end, I could completely configure everything from the ground up. And as a result, that really kind of became a standard for us here in support to say, if you want to stage an environment for reproduction, you can do it this way. And you can just, you can take and pre-configure it with a single script in a few minutes.
Mm-hmm. And
I'm sorry. I was just to that I was able to take the knowledge that I picked up from that and just pre-configuring a VRA environment right on vSphere or in the cloud. And what I did was I can take that information and using the same format, HCL. I can easily do the same kind of thing for AWS, for Azure. I know exactly how the language works. And then the only thing I have to learn on the back end then is what do I want to deploy in Azure. So if I wanted to, I can simply copy this directory, modify the code to point to an Azure environment instead, and then just deploy that as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to clarify that when you're talking, vRealize automation, you're really talking about deploying it as a solution you're running in your environment, because we're going to talk about how these things work together. And you're just using it as an example right now of a solution that gets deployed, right? I mean, that's
right. And the solution being, when I mentioned before that there's this wide range of community contribution and things like that. Well, there is a VRA plugin that I can configure a VRA environment with. There is a plugin for NSX. If I wanted to automate the configuration of NSX environments, I can do that. And the exact same logic that I would use for any of these, I can apply to AWS, to Azure, to Google Cloud. I mean, if I want to just take the same kind of constructs and concepts, I can just apply these laterally and rapidly learn the ability to just deploy things to multiple clouds. I don't have to go back in and learn from the ground up how to do this in Azure.
Yeah, the only point I was making was that you're just using it as an example of a particular software stack, but it could be anything,
Yeah, exactly. And once you learn the one that you're in, that really is driving you, it's easy to apply that across, right? That at that point, you've really, it's that simple. So you get a handle on it, and then now you can start to apply it anywhere you want.
Yeah, I was making the point about the software stack because we are also going to talk about how vRealize as a solution works with Terraform, and I wanted to just keep those things separate. That in one case we're talking about, it could have been any software stack, and then we're going to talk about these things cooperating because they kind of live in the same space, right? vRealize automation and Terraform, but they actually do very complementary things. They can do very complementary things.
Yeah.
Maybe we should just switch gears there. Eric, did you want any questions on Terraform before we talk about vRealize automation?
Not really. I think I understand that, and it is interesting. Do we know where some of the big repositories of Terraform scripts examples are, like out there? I assume they're somewhere. I just haven't spent any time in this space to go like, where would I go find these repositories of such examples?
So typically, what you're going to find is when you're looking at a Terraform provider. They call them a provider. It's essentially just a plugin that teaches Terraform how to interact with an endpoint like Azure. You'll find that within those, it's usually in a Git repository, and within that Git repository, there will be samples. So almost all of the providers that I've looked at so far have an extensive list of examples, as well as detailed documentation of how to take their example and kind of build on that for your own needs.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Yeah, it's funny. The first thing that popped in my head, Eric, when you asked the question was Git, because it's like it's the answer to almost everything when it comes to where do you get anything.
Yeah. It is true. It is true. And I know that there have several guys that were big PowerCLI, PowerShell people have gone and started working in Terraform. So this makes a lot of sense that, why that's occurring. So, yep.
So, Cody, maybe we can switch gears and just talk a little bit about vRealize automation, sort of set the stage of what it is, and we'll come back to the intersection of these two in a bit. But maybe you just tell us about vRealize automation. A lot of people may not know what it is.
Yeah, so vRealize automation is essentially an enterprise-ready solution for automating almost anything that's IT service related. It provides for multi-cloud provisioning. It provides for versioned JSON-based blueprinting system. So with Terraform, I mentioned that is code, almost code first is the way it was designed. Previous releases of VRA were UI-based specifically. This latest version is a hybrid of both UI and code-driven solutions to kind of address both. It integrates with, so there's multi-cloud provisioning to pretty much any of the popular clouds, right? Azure, AWS, Google, vSphere environments, AWS, VMware Cloud on AWS. It also has built-in integration for solutions like obviously Terraform. You've got Ansible, Chef, Puppet, all the popular components like that. So we integrate within that as well. As far as the actual provisioning system, and actually let me step back because I like to say that it's designed to automate everything. A lot of people look at VRA and their assumption is that this is an infrastructure provisioning tool, right? And it is really good at doing that. But the thing is that it has integration into our orchestrator tool set, and with integration with orchestrator, that's going to provide you almost anything as a service. I can create and automate, Active Directory tasks if I wanted to, and provide those to my users through vRealize automation. So it's catalog based on the front end, and it focuses on providing just IT services, self-service to end users. It does provide the ability also for cloud agnostic blueprinting, which is kind of a new concept in at least most of the tools that I've seen so far, in the fact that I could create a CentOS VM blueprint, and then I can send it off and allow the system through whatever rules I've decided to determine whether to apply that to AWS or Azure or wherever it's going to live. Because to the end user, to the developer, it's not always crucial where it lives. They just need access to the resources.
Yeah, you're starting to hit on something I think super critical and important. I'll just make a point first that I think what I heard you say was that there's a lot of things that vRealize automation does that you might think are overlapping with something like a Terraform, but there are things that are just purely complementary. And you started to talk about sort of like this decision making and what I would call policy. Maybe you could talk about policy and governance and a tool like vRealize automation versus a Terraform.
Yeah. So within Terraform, obviously what you're doing is you're enabling your developer or your end user to script their infrastructure creation, right? And with that, the management and the ownership of that infrastructure belongs entirely with the creator of it. It also requires that your end users have to have full rights to whatever it is that you are going to be provisioning, and that's typical of any kind of authorization that you're going to give to create infrastructure. One of the things that VRA is good at is governance in and of itself, right? It's always had a real focus on abstracting IT services, but also governing who can and cannot access them. Excuse me. With VRA 8, the later releases here, they simplify the process. They allow you to control access at a few different levels. There are roles that you can give within VRA. So these users can create blueprints. These users can consume catalog content. I can break out the catalog content and say, for instance, as I mentioned before, Active Directory, if I wanted to do that, these are the users that have access to execute and manage these Active Directory resources. These are my developers for these processes. And then I can group people into these things called projects. And it's essentially the construct of a project is a group that is assigned a specific subset of resources as well as limitations within those resources. So I can create a set of resources for each of the developer teams that controls or limits the amount of resource they can take up. And at that point, then, logically the question comes back of, well, what about when they hit a wall? What if we're not providing the right thing? We also have the ability to provide approvals. And what an approval is going to do in VRA is it's not just can I have this yes or no? I can trigger an approval based on a user that's requesting, say, a considerably large amount of memory, or what seems like it's a very large amount of storage. And then I can approve or I can deny based on these things. I can require approvals based on these limitations. So there's a number of different ways that we can govern access and control to the resources that our people are needing.
And you've got a lot of flexibility for one thing, because I kind of know from looking at this before that like you can just also focus on policies that are at the blueprint level, right? You can say, hey, this blueprint can only be deployed on Amazon. This one can only be deployed on Azure. And it's sort of like another way of thinking about policies, because that's more specific to the environment and the kind of resource it is, basically.
Yeah, the engine behind this decision making is it's a lot more complicated than you would initially think, but it's easy to really maintain. A lot of the way that we drive these decisions in VRA is just through tagging. So if I have what I mentioned before, like a cloud agnostic application stack that I built that I could deploy to vSphere, I could deploy it to Azure. I could have certain tagging involved in the project, for instance. So the developers, this group of developers, they're only going to have, when they request the same blueprint that these other folks would request, based on their group, they're going to get routed to vSphere, right? I want them on this hardware. I want them on this storage and this compute. I can get very granular. I can say, this user is requesting something, and as soon as he says, I'm looking for this particular thing with this amount of storage, now I can start to say, okay, based on the amount of storage or the type of storage you wanted, you need like ultra high speed storage for this. That's going to route you to vSphere, to this storage policy. So I can really control the path and the decision making without having to make one-off decisions for every request or make modifications to people's needs as they're requesting them.
Right, and this just all happens automatically in the background. This is not something that they're like have to futz with, and it's just determined up front by effectively by policy, right? Because these are the policies of the group or the enterprise. You can do those things.
Yep.
So then if you were working with something like Terraform, or you mentioned like other configuration tools that are out there, right? You got Ansible, SaltStack, and Puppet, and any number of things people use to configure their environments. Then how would that work with the VRA or something like that, where you're then looking for that to then add governance to that process?
So the governance is really based on the consumption phase, right? There is governance around who can create and build, but your governance, really, a lot of it is based around the consumption. So if I wanted to, a blueprint, for example, which the blueprint, of course, it's similar to what Terraform would use as just a script of infrastructure or something like that. But if I were to create a blueprint, I can build in integrations there with Ansible and Chef and Puppet for post provisioning configuration. Another thing that VRA does really well is lifecycle management. And that's a key to how we do integrate with different things, and how we can extend what we're doing with provisioning. So a good example of this is I could the vRealize automation lifecycle of a provisioning request would be that the machine is requested, it's built. Once it's approved, it gets built, it gets managed after a certain amount of lease. The lease comes up after so many days, and then after sending notifications to the end user, it's going to shut itself down. It's going to archive it, maybe store it, and then destroy it ultimately. Well, during this process, at various points, I can inject extensibility. I can say, okay, before you build that out, I want you to go out and build this out in DNS. Now go ahead and build the machine. The machine gets built. Everything's there. Now, when you tear it, now when it automatically goes up and cleans itself up, go back out to DNS, clean up DNS. So there's a lot of these little hooks that you can get into where you can control the life cycle, but also where you're connecting in with your integrations.
Mm-hmm. So
yeah, I would think that's actually really valuable when we talk about server sprawl. And I know that one of the biggest problems I have on AWS in my own world is that, we just forget to do cleanup. We forget the policies on the back end. It's the day 3 operations or whatever we call that, where it's like, I need to, and the nice thing about that model is that then you can set all those policies up, and your customer can sign off on it when they go to provision, and you have some kind of, cleanup at the tail end of the project so that it gets done. Otherwise, these things just continue to consume electricity and cycles and all the rest.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I think that's very powerful, this idea of policies extending beyond that initial provisioning, and also addressing things that have to happen downstream, like right sizing things or notifications to tell people that, that they're they're underutilizing their resources, those kinds of things. I guess on the prior question, Cody, I had was, I think about, Terraform is a great scripting language. People are using it, a lot already. How would these things live together? And I'm thinking about the scenario of maybe you have a handful of developers that are really building out a lot of the environments, and then can you do something like then import those into VRA and then make them available to other people? Well, how would Terraform work side by side with VRA?
So there's a couple of use cases, thanks to the hard work from the business unit, but one of the use cases that we see a lot of anyhow is recently with the vRealize Automation Cloud, the SaaS version of vRealize Automation, we have provided the ability to take your Terraform scripting and bring it directly into a catalog item in VRA. So I could take the infrastructure scripting that I'm already familiar with, that I've already built, and that is part of my standard process. I can bring that directly into a blueprint, and then I can wrap that blueprint with all of the appropriate approval requirements, with pointing them to specific resources, rerouting them however I wanted to do that, as well as managing things from a day 2 perspective. So you wouldn't have to rewrite any of this stuff in order for it to now work with the governance components of VRA Cloud.
Right. So yep. So I was going to say it becomes the basis for the blueprint, right? It's like
exactly. I mean, you've already written all this out, right? You've already done the work. You've got it written out, and this is how you do your work. But you're going to need to kind of control those resources.
Does it pull it into the system so that you have like version control of these type of scripts, or how do you manage that?
So there's a couple of different pieces to this. Obviously, there is some overlap between these two products. So VRA in and of itself has automatically has a blueprint versioning system. So I can create a blueprint and just say create a new version. VRA also integrates with Git, so I could essentially manage all of my versioning with a Git repository. And that's exactly how we integrate with your Terraform. If you're using Terraform, you probably have them on a Git repository, your versioning already. I can connect my VRA to your Git repository with Terraform, and that's how I'm going to pull in my Terraform components.
Great answer. Thanks.
Yep.
So it sounds like if Terraform's your thing, you're already using it, you're using it to write all your environments, then, and if what you're looking for is to add governance capabilities, day 2, life cycle of the environments, those kinds of things, then you can bring these things together and kind of get all of that together. So you don't have to give up Terraform. You can continue to use it, but you also can then get a solution that adds governance on top of it.
Correct. So that's the idea of using Terraform from within VRA. The other direction is to use Terraform to directly request and configure and work with VRA. So I can essentially have Terraform as my go-to component for my developers to then reach out to VRA to request the infrastructure resources. So
Okay.
some of the advantages in that different direction is, as an operations team, I could build out my resources, my governance, my resource restrictions and controls. I can build out my blueprints. I can build all of this stuff out and have it all ready to go. And then the development teams that are doing all of their work in Terraform can use Terraform to VRA, using the VRA provider for Terraform, to request and manage, destroy, rebuild, or whatever it is, their blueprints on VRA.
Mm-hmm.
So they don't ever really look at VRA at that point. Everything is going from their normal perspective. They're using VRA as their provider endpoint. VRA is handling all of our routing to Azure, our routing to AWS or vSphere, and all that back-end work. VRA gets to handle all of that. All the developers have to do is say, give me my resources, and you wait for VRA to provide them.
So rather than specifically writing directly to Amazon or Azure or whatever, they're calling a blueprint inside of their HCL, basically, that then just it completely wraps it. And you, instead of just getting like raw infrastructure, you're getting governed infrastructure, right? You're getting something that's governed by VRA. Oh, that's interesting.
And
that's cool.
And what we're seeing, where we're seeing that showing up in a lot of customer environments are, you have there are a lot of customers where they're looking to roll out a fairly robust vRealize automation environment with extensibility and a lot of IT servicing, right? Not just provisioning machines. They're looking to really build a lot around that. And what they have is they have multiple departments in multiple teams. Some of them are using Terraform, some of them are using something else. And what they're using it for is the vRealize automation becomes kind of the hub of where operations can control everything, as well as obviously the machines that are being requested through VRA can also then be managed by vRealize operations, or built in with log insight and things like that, so that the operations team has visibility across everything, multiple cloud, of course. Mm-hmm. But then you don't have to re-educate your developers who are invested in Terraform to say, we're building this out, but we're going to create a separate set of rules and guidelines for you because you're Terraform users. We can just bring everything through a centralized hub, and then it's all managed the same way. The only difference is how people are accessing the resources.
And they continue to use Terraform as their tool for writing infrastructure as code. It's just there's a wrapped component that they're putting in there that's VRA's blueprint, or effectively that sort of, when they request environment, instead of saying, I want to do this on Amazon, they just specify the type of blueprint. It gets wrapped in, and then off they go, basically.
Exactly. Yep.
Cool.
Yep. That's right.
Cool. That's powerful. Hey, Eric, any more on that? Because I think this has been a great tour of Terraform and vRealize. I think
the only thing that I kind of touch on maybe is risk management and security. How does vRealize and Terraform all plug into this kind of like risk management and security piece?
So from a security aspect, there's obviously multiple layers of security that we're talking about. One of the nice things about using that second scenario of having VRA be the hub, Terraform be the requesting piece, is that you're essentially taking all of the authentication and access to your corporation's AWS, Azure, all these endpoints that they have sort of, a considerable amount of access to, and you're centralizing that within the operations side so that they can control the security, they can control security groups. Because engineering, if you give somebody the ability to request a machine to work on, they're going to request a machine to work on. There's going to be a consideration of security, but if it's a development machine, they're just going to crank it out, work on it, destroy it. Security really sometimes kind of gets left behind when you're working from that perspective. And if you're going to be really security conscious as a developer and you're using a tool like Terraform or some other automation tool, there's a considerable question of how much of the security is your responsibility to manage in that infrastructure. I mean, the more power you have, the more responsibility you have to learn and manage the security components. So tagging resources in VRA can, or just building out the resource components correctly, can essentially ensure that the provisioned resources are tagged with proper security groups. They're tagged with proper boundaries in what can connect to and from them, firewall access. So everything that you could automate infrastructure-wise, you can do through VRA. And again, you're taking the complexity of building all of that away from the developers who just need the resources. You're giving it back to operations, but you're not impacting the development workflow or the CI/CD, right? You're not getting in the way of that pipeline. You're just allowing the components that are being requested to auto wrap with proper security and requirements.
Yeah, I definitely could see how using VRA would improve security, because if you have a blueprint and you always wanted to leverage microsegmentation as an example, right? You could make sure that that's in the blueprint. That is the representation of the environment that's going to get down deployed. And then when someone requests it, they're just embedding this whole block into their Terraform, right? Where then it's automatic that that microsegmentation gets deployed down with the environment, and you can control it. Whereas if everybody goes off and independently goes and provisions an environment, it's very hard to control that. Yeah, I could definitely see how that would improve things.
All right. Cool. Thanks. I got another topic that I don't know if we've touched on yet or not, but I always ask this kind of guests that we bring on podcasts, which is vSphere 7, right? vSphere 7 now has Kubernetes, right? So that's kind of a shift, and the industry shifted into Kubernetes and that whole bit. And now we've just integrated into the data center by giving you vSphere 7. You have Kubernetes. How does vRealize automation touch some of this now? Because, automating, containers floating around, I mean, I assume, and I don't know if Terraform gets into that, but one of the things as a cloud architect, I'm always looking at modern technologies, where my app teams are going. Where do you see this, playing out as we go forward into the new Kubernetes world?
So both Terraform and vRealize Automation have provider or endpoints to create, manage, and day to modify Terraform and containers. So vRealize Automation has an entire container infrastructure built into it for deploying, managing, and controlling containers. In fact, an interesting side note. Obviously, I'm in the support world, right? So looking under the hood is kind of what I do all the time. vRealize Automation 8.0 was released with all of the services built in, all converted to Kubernetes pods. So the actual structure of vRealize Automation 8 is actually Kubernetes at this point. So definitely throwing ourselves into that, fully. It's been really good from a support perspective to have containerized services that can just be destroyed and recreated just willy-nilly, and they come back and they cluster together really well. But from the perspective of deploying, managing, controlling, all of that is already baked in. So the only thing you're doing is you're creating your Kubernetes endpoint, you're pointing your infrastructure towards it, and of course you're wrapping governance, security, whatever you need to do from the operations side, and then your end users are either going to API requests, they're going to Terraform requests, they're going to go to a catalog and click on a shopping cart type request to request those containers.
Nice. Okay, that's what I expect. I think a lot of people are going to come up to speed with that and learn that over the next year or so as the excitement for vSphere 7 and Kubernetes goes. Other one that I have, David, and you can correct me if I shouldn't go here, but from a licensing perspective, how does vRealize deliver to enterprise customers these days? Right, like how do people actually get it? You talk SaaS service for a little bit, so it sounds like we have vRealize Automation or vRealize Suite on as a SaaS service. I think we have, obviously, most people know about the on-prem. Why don't we talk a little bit about how people use this? I sometimes hear, not often, but sometimes I hear that, hey, I got vSphere 7, I use vSAN, I'm doing NSXT, but I haven't really gotten around to vRealize. And so we're always conscious of okay, how many enterprise customers actually have this? It's sitting on a shelf somewhere. And how do we, do they already have it? Do they need to do some action to get it? I think you'd go where I'm going here. Give me your thoughts.
So Cody, do you know this? I mean, I know a little bit. I mean, I just haven't looked at it in a while, but do you sort of know what the latest on licensing is?
So I would say that I'm definitely not the expert on the licensing aspect. I'm definitely more invested in the technical aspect. There is standalone SaaS. And I believe there's a synergy out there between them, but the idea is that we try to make sure that, at least specifically in the cloud management side, that your cloud management products on-prem, you should be able to have a certain percentage or a certain access to SaaS as well. One of the drivers that we see, at least from the technical side, is that the technology that's underneath our SaaS versions of our on-prem products is the exact same technology. So, for example, what shows up in our VRA cloud or VRA cloud offering, I mentioned that currently there's Terraform embedded there. You can go Terraform from VRA cloud. You can pretty much expect to see that show up on the on-prem releases in a future release, because the underlying technology is basically the same. From a licensing perspective, I probably can't speak with too much authority on it.
No worries about that.
Yeah, no, I think so. Eric had to go look it up real quick and just see if we had already announced all this. So, but just adding to that, we have on-prem, we have the SaaS versions, but vRealize also particularly are kind of leading the way for VMware around having a universal license that allows you to move back and forth across the on-prem and SaaS world without having to keep swapping licenses. So I think that they're a little ahead of the game for the rest of the company there, actually.
Fine. All right, nice to know. And Terraform and in the work, the interfaces I need to connect the two, that's all bundled. I should just be able to get that and go to GitHub, get my connectors, and away I go.
Yeah, absolutely. So you can get a VRA or VRA Terraform provider. There is one for VRA 7. There's one for VRA 8. And again, in the VRA or the vRealize Automation Cloud offering, there is the ability right in the blueprint to just drag, drop, and create Terraform scripting directly in that blueprint as well.
Cool. Hey, Cody, maybe you tell us, you did a session recently at VMworld around this whole topic. It's kind of how I came across you. Maybe you could mention that and just tell us what the number is on that session.
Yeah. So I did a take charge of your infrastructure as code with vRealize Automation. Obviously that's specifically about taking your Terraform content that exists and wrapping that and getting control of it with governance and security and things like that. It is MCOP 1773. And I would also give a shout out to another one. There's another one that is Terraform consumption at enterprise scale. That one is focused more on the SaaS, the VRA cloud perspective, and that is HCMB 2257.
Cool. Yeah. And then the VMworld stuff is up there for on demand.
Yep.
So if you haven't seen it, check it out.
Very good. Very good. I always like to follow up with what are your goals and aspirations for the next year coming up? I know we can't talk confidentially about what we got for product wise, but what are your hopes and aspirations for this space as we go into the next year?
At least in from my perspective, it really is about the integration with third-party products. Our engineering, I'm obviously I'm grouped in with the solution and the support of our products, and in a space like cloud management, the support of our products is always sort of expanding beyond the boundaries of what VMware owns, right? Which is why I did this Terraform session, and I've done internal training on Terraform with VRA. So I'm looking to expand out to Ansible to provide our engineers a really good view of Ansible. I'm also looking to work with the Salt Stack team to drive a lot of enablement there. There is integration Salt Stack to VRA that we're looking at, and so there's a lot of these things that are. I mean, there's always something in the pipeline to learn, and a lot of it is, a lot of third-party stuff is what usually kind of comes into my purview, because you get so many wild environments that are built in so many really creative ways, and we have to be able to support all of them, right?
All right. Follow-up question is, what is the coolest thing you've ever automated with vRealize automation?
I would say the let's see, coolest thing I've automated with vRealize automation. Well, additional vRealize automation environments, right? Sort of dogfooding.
the old nested vRealize.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, it's like I'd like to request a vRealize automation environment from my vRealize automation environment, but once it gets deployed, that's when I was able to do Terraform to fully configure everything so it's ready to just log into and use. I mean, we had cloud endpoints, blueprints, everything's just sitting there. on a newly developed system. So it's like you could stand up an entire vRealize automation stack, multi-node stack with blueprints and everything fully built out in like a few hours.
Right.
It's
nice.
Pretty amazing.
That's pretty cool. And because I still got you and we still have a few minutes left, I think I'll throw another one at you because it's fun. What's the coolest platform you've ever worked on, either biggest or smallest, or when you talk hardware, like, because I'm such a hardware geek, which is funny because I work in a virtualized environment where I don't ever see my hardware anymore. But the question for you is, what's the coolest hardware you've ever used to do some of this stuff?
I got to tell you, I am hardware broken, right? So I have been so invested in virtualization that almost everything that I've ever done has been either internally cloud-based or externally cloud-based. So to me, AWS and Azure are essentially the infrastructure hardware that I'm looking at.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to change that question to what's the coolest cloud vendor you've ever used, because no one actually does anything on real hardware anymore. It's all just out.
Yeah, I mean, I do like our VMware Cloud on AWS. I mean, like it's streamlined compatibility. It's really nice that way. I mean, it's all the stuff I'm familiar with, but it's all hosted AWS. Generally, AWS is what I use as sort of my test bed. I do like Azure. I wouldn't really say that I prefer one over another. I kind of appreciate them all equally, but I think familiarity keeps pulling me back to AWS these days.
Nice. David Jasso, I don't have anything else other than, what good books have you read this year? But we'll skip that one and just
I'm listening to a lot of podcasts.
Yeah, exactly. And if you're listening to this, we appreciate it. So Cody Carlson, David Jasso, do we want to wrap up?
Yeah, we're good. Cody, it's been awesome having you on. It's, like I said, it was interesting to run across a solution architect that's in customer support, because I don't tend to think about that role there. And I think the Terraform and vRealize stuff's really cool too. So thanks for joining us today and being our guest.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot, and have a great rest of your year.